Let's talk about China. Just about every major issue in this country and around the world now comes back to China, and a lot of experts are now talking about this in Cold War terms. A lot of government officials trying to resist that, but a lot of observers, very wise observers, saying this is now a new Cold War. Let's catch up with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's Michael Shoebridge, live from Canberra. Thanks for joining us, Michael. Really keen to get your thoughts on this first up. Is it correct to talk about this in Cold War terms? It's US versus China, US and its allies lining up against China?
I think it's that level of international struggle, but I think it's misleading to use the Cold War cookie cutter, because China is a very different beast to the Soviet Union. China is enmeshed in the global economy in a way the Soviet Union never was. So it's useful to talk about it as a real conflict between two superpowers that's going to define a lot about our world. But we've got to approach it differently to that Cold War between the USSR and the US. That's
a very important point. The USSR was enmeshed, it was contained almost economically within its own borders or with its satellites, a different economic system contained within those realms, whereas China, although it's a communist nation, has really embraced the global free market economy, in fact, tended to dominate it in many areas.
Yes, although the funny thing is they have nothing like a free market back home. And this is at the nub of a whole lot of issues between Australia and China. Think about the foreign investment rules that the Treasurer released last week, saying that Australia would control foreign investment into critical sectors, digital technology and other areas for national security purposes. Beijing's pretending they're outraged about that, but they have a much stricter set of controls back home. So they love openness when it's other people's, but they have no intention of giving that openness within their own economy.
It's a huge flaw for them. But when you think about other differences, also it's the USSR had those satellite nations, if you like, in Eastern Europe and to a lesser extent elsewhere. China doesn't really have that, although is that what it's trying to develop through roping in so many countries around the world under its Belt and Road Initiative?
I think that was the idea, to build dependency. You know, African countries are a good example, but you could see how this is really not working terribly well now. So the Belt and Road investments, a lot of commentators said a lot of them look like bad business deals. Well, if they look like bad business deals before the global recession that we've got now, they're really bad deals now. So the Chinese are left with some really bad business arrangements and African countries wanting Beijing to write off debt. And Beijing is making comforting noises, but it's not going to do that. So it's not turning into the great path to influence that Beijing may have thought.
Now, we know about the Five Eyes intelligence and security arrangement. It's essentially an Anglosphere, Australia, the US, the UK, Canada and New Zealand that share so much intelligence. Josh Frydenberg announced this week that he's instituted an economic arrangement between those same five countries where the treasurers or finance ministers will get together a lot and coordinate economic policy. That will be seen, won't it, by Beijing as an attempt to build up, I suppose, some cohesion in resisting China's economic ambitions?
Well, and I hope it is seen that way, because that's what it is. But it won't just be those Five Eyes partners. There's a push in the large, powerful democratic countries of the world. So that will bring in India, Japan, France, Germany and South Korea as well. And that's because trust is the new appreciating international currency. You know, the previous globalized economy was all about what's the cheapest place I can do this. We've now realised that when you really need to rely on things, you need trust with the government and trust with the companies from that jurisdiction. So that idea of the democratic world really investing in each other much more is as important as controlling the way an authoritarian China reaches into our own economy.
Now, China has reached into our economy again today. It's Ministry of Education has issued a statement directed at its own students who might be thinking of coming back to Australia to complete their studies, and it says that the new global pneumonia, as they refer to the coronavirus pandemic, has not been effectively controlled, so there are risks in international travel. And it says during the epidemic there have been multiple discriminatory incidents against Asians in Australia, and it's recommending its students carefully consider their risk assessments of coming to Australia. This is China trying to dissuade its own students from coming here. This is not directed so much at their students, surely, but at Australia and doing us economic harm.
Well, I think they're doing a very good thing, because what they're saying is, all right, so if the Australian university sector and the Australian tourism sector would like to rebuild your business like you had it before the pandemic, with a huge reliance on Chinese students and Chinese tourists, then please do so, because we will use that as a stick to coerce you with. We're foreshadowing that if you do rebuild your model around us, we will use it against you. So I think it's a wonderful foreshadowing of their coercive behaviour, and it tells our universities and it tells our tourist sector the stupidest thing you could do is rebuild your institutions around that China market.
Well, they were warned about that in the lead-up, a lot of warnings that they were too reliant on China. You're right, that's the message they should take now, but there's no doubt that it's an act of diplomatic aggression from China to try and do that to us now.
Yes, it is, but I think this new frankness that, yes, we will coerce you, is quite refreshing from Beijing, because if anyone was in doubt of that, they only need to listen to the Chinese government themselves. So if any university administrator or planner or audit committee member is not factoring in a much higher business risk with Chinese students, then they're making a fundamental error and they're doing a disservice to their own institution. Well,
one of the countries they should look to get more students from to balance their risks is India, as we should be doing in our trading relationships as well. But a lot of tension, as ever, long-running tension between India and China on their border, but that's been flaring at the moment. How worried should we be about that?
I think we've got to realise that this is the new China that the world is living with. You can see it in the South China Sea, you can see it on the India-China border. These are deliberate moves to use military power to expand their borders and to resolve long-standing disputes with neighbours. And it's not being done peacefully, it's being done aggressively. So it's having a clear eye about the nature of the Chinese state that we need. And I think it's disturbing to see a group of 8 university leaders trying to mollify Beijing and say, please, please tell us what we can do to rebuild our dependency. I think it is a naive and failed approach.
Michael, thanks so much for joining us.